Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello. My name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast bonus. Now, usually there's no book reading on these bonus episodes. These tend to be traditionally interviews, rants, raves, insights, and other audio musings, and sometimes conversations with people about leadership. Because listening to me and an interesting guest talk about leadership for a couple of hours is still better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book. But we're going to break that rule today. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about two books that are, they're typically put in the business and management space, but really they cover the realm of politics and culture, religion, and even geopolitics and geography and demography. We are going to talk about these two books in the context of what I believe is happening in the country right now. And I've said this before on the podcast this year in my New Year's 2024 episode, which you should go back and listen to. It's now I believe it's now is the season 3 trailer for this year. And it also, this conversation goes along with the tone that I'm seeking to set with these podcast episodes this year. And it is a tone that is focused around the idea that we are at the end of a cycle of dysfunction, chaos, disappointment, and despair in our country. And it is time for us to begin to plan ruthlessly for the future. And the future always shows up, whether we feel good about it or not. I've invited on today a guest to help me talk about this, because just hearing me ramble about it for 10 minutes isn't quite going to get it. And my guest today is the former lead campus pastor of Stonewater Church in Granbury, Texas, who has now transitioned to being a financial advisor. And we will leave his current position nameless other than that. Brian Bagley. Now, Brian talked with us about the responsibilities of a Christian believer in opposition to the civil magistrate and the state, what I gently called Caesar, in episode number 65 of our podcast last year. And you'll be able to check out a link to that episode in the show notes below the player of this episode. And so I'd like to welcome back to the podcast, Brian. How you doing, Brian?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. It's going to be a good topic. I can't wait to talk about it.
Well, so, a little bit of background on this. So Brian actually sort of turned me on to this book that I'm going to summarize here at the beginning of our podcast. And the two books that we're going to talk about, again, they lay the foundation for where we're going to go and what we're going to talk about, not just on this episode, but for the remainder of the year. And I think potentially for the next couple of years on the podcast. Brian turned me on to the book by William Strauss and Neil Howe, The Fourth Turning. And the subtitle of that book is what the cycles of history tell us about America's next rendezvous with destiny. Now, this book was published around 1997, and I was familiar with some of the ideas, particularly the ideas around generations that come out of the Fourth Turning. And Strauss and Howe did an excellent job of sort of promoting that over the course of the last now almost 30 years. But I wasn't really as in-depthly, I didn't have my arms wrapped around, I'll frame it that way, some of the more in-depth concepts, particularly the concept of an 80-year Saeculum, the cycles of history, and the seasons of time. And so I'd like to summarize chapter 1, which sets up everything from the fourth turning. Now, I'm not going to read from the book as I normally would in a podcast here. Instead, I'm just going to summarize, and then Brian and I are going to jump in and talk a little bit about some of the ideas in the fourth turning. So if you read the first chapter, Strauss and Howe postulate that from their position in 1997, winter is coming, kind of like Game of Thrones, right? And the first chapter lays out the central thesis of cyclical change, the tensions within a political and technological version of progressive change, and the ways in which people are underserved in understanding the historical cycles of change. One of the larger points that Strauss and Howe make in chapter 1 of the fourth turning is that we're actually not taught history as a cyclical series of cycles. We are instead taught history as a never-ending arrow moving forward, and the arrow never moves backward, which of course allows us to progress, both capital P and small p progress, but it also blinds us to chaos. It blinds us to awakenings. It blinds us to changes that occur and can be predicted with cyclical certainty going back, at least in the West, at least 500 years. And Strauss and Howe did their research on this, and the book is full of charts and graphs proving their point. As a matter of fact, if you go and look at their Wikipedia article, the Wikipedia profile on them, there is the Strauss and Howe generational theory, which sort of summarizes some of the things in chapter 1. Now, speaking about generations, Strauss and Howe in the fourth turning postulate the generations follow the same cyclical historical turnings that are in what they describe as an 80-year Saeculum. And Brian and I are going to talk about this in a minute. And that there are 4 distinct archetypes that always occur in the same order over the course of 80 years. The first archetype is the progressive artist. Typically, if you're going to think about it in terms of World War II to now, which is the last 80-year cycle that we are at the end of, that would be the silent generation. The silent generation weren't the people who fought in World War II, but they were the kids of the people, not the kids. They were the young adults who were not old enough to go and fight in World War II, but were old enough to be impacted by the end of World War II. By the way, the folks who went and fought in World War II, they were called the GI generation. So the GI generation and the silent generation overlap. Then the second generation is the missionary or prophet generation. The baby boomers, about whom a lot of digital ink is now being spilled, and the people who are probably the most self-promoting of the last part of the last century and this one. The missionary generation or the prophet generation were individuals who were the daughters and sons, in some cases older daughters and sons, of members of the silent generation, and who were also either younger daughters or younger sons of people who were in the GI generation. Then you have the lost generation or the nomad generation. The nomad generation or the lost generation is the generation in the last half of the American century, of the 20th century, that were described as Gen X, individuals born between 1961 and 1981. I was born between 1961 and 1981. Brian was born between 1961 and 1981. And many of us had boomers as parents or were the product of either failed first marriages or failed second marriages. The boomers changed a lot of things. And then finally, we cycle back to the GI or the hero generation. The hero generation, as defined by Strauss and Howe, is the millennial generation. The millennial generation are those individuals born between 1984, traditionally, and 1997. Although in Strauss and Howe's estimation, they could be individuals born between 1981 and 1997. And the hero generation is always the generation that saves everybody else. I know what you're thinking. The millennials, the everybody gets a trophy generation, they're going to save anybody? Well, by virtue of numbers, they are the first largest generation right now in American history. I believe there's somewhere between 85 and 90 million of them. The next largest generation was the baby boomers at 65 million. And if you don't understand the kind of impact the boomers had, well, I have a whole bunch of history I want to show you on this thing called the internet. So those are the four generations that always occur in the same order, according to Strauss and Howe, in an 80-year cycle or over a long human lifespan. There are also parts of the cycle that we were going to discuss today, including awakenings, crises, and turnings. But before I get into the second book that we're going to talk about today, which is Peter Zeihan's The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization, I want to bring in Brian here because I've talked quite a bit. And I want to talk a little bit about Strauss and Howe and how you got turned on to the fourth turning and what you think about this book. So go ahead, Brian, take it away.
Yeah, well, so I got introduced to that book, The Fourth Turning, back during COVID. And I like a lot of people probably listening to this podcast, I've felt for a long time that we're in the middle of an unraveling. Okay. And I've felt that way for, I don't know, a long time. Just things just don't seem right. It wasn't like it was when we were growing up, in the 80s. And, things don't seem to necessarily be getting better all the time. And so like COVID for me, and of course I was during that time when that happened, I was pastoring a very large church, like you mentioned. And there were several people that were coming to me saying, hey, how do I can't in good conscience take this shot, and anyway, that led to, I had to minister to them and help them walk through that. And I helped several get religious exemptions but even religious exemptions aside, just pastoring people, helping them to understand what's happening to them was a big part of what I was doing. And I remember I came across a podcast, blog and Mablog by a guy named Doug Wilson. And in one of those, he mentioned just offhand this idea of this fourth turning. And anyway, I can't remember exactly the connection he made, but he said, hey, we're entering or we're in the midst of a winter, of a really dark time. And I was like, well, that's true. So I wanted to find out more about it. So that's kind of how I got connected to the book itself and the concepts of the book. There's a famous passage in Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, where the writer, he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. There's nothing new under the sun, right? And so there's a lot of wisdom in that, of course. And this book kind of it sort of echoes that a little bit, right? Like there's things change. There are things happen differently, but at the root, there's this pattern that there's nothing new under the sun. There have been hard times before. There will be hard times again. We're in a hard time now. It can be navigated. It can be dealt with, and we have to endure and be faithful in that.
Well, and when I read this book, it caused me to pause because it made me think about my own life, right? So I turned 21 in September of 2001. Literally 3 weeks after September 11th, I turned 21.
Yeah.
And I've said this before on the podcast, but I'll repeat it for those of you who are listening who are new. It seems as though over the last 20 years, literally there has been nothing but chaos and confusion, whether it's at a cultural level, at a financial level, at an economic level, at a spiritual level, at a technological level, at a material, physical level, and of course, most notably and most sharply at a cultural level. And so, I remember Andrew Breitbart, who said that, politics is always downstream from culture. And you said to me once that culture is downstream from religion, which in my brain frames as culture is downstream from meaning. Whatever the headwaters are of that hierarchy, everything's going to flow downstream from that.
Right.
I was there for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I knew people who went there and fought there, and some people who died there, and caught injuries there. I know people who lost everything in 2008. I graduated from college a little bit later than most, and it was only by the grace of God that I was able to ensure, and I say that with absolutely no guile or exaggeration. It was only by the grace of God that I was able to secure a job that I held on to for 5 years. And there's no way I would have been able to do that if I had A, probably not gone to college, or B, not been positioned in the place that I was positioned in the way that I was positioned. And then of course we went through, and I remember hanging chads in 2001 and disputed elections. Then of course we went through the whole hope and change, what I call hoax from Barack Obama. There was no hope and there was no change because he made all the bankers whole. So I remember Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. And it seems as though, and then of course, you get Donald Trump and you get 2020 and which I think was the high watermark of nonsense. And through all of that runs the internet and social media. I look at the last 20 years of my life when I was reading this book, and I thought, my God, it's been nothing but chaos the whole entire time. And the generation that comes after the baby boomers, but before the millennials, typically, according to Strauss and Howe, is the one in history that typically has to navigate and survive a crisis period, but they are usually not granted the fruits of their labor when you get over on the other side and you go into a high. And I started really thinking, not that I need to rescue a generation. I think Joe Rogan's probably doing a better job of that than I am. And Jordan Peterson's probably got something to say about that too, as well as Lex Friedman. But I think it's time for us to start talking about solutions to some of these crisis points and some of these crisis problems. And of course, the great books can do that. But Strauss and Howe really solidified that in my head. When we think about an 80-year cycle, sort of explain what they are talking about when they're talking about a Saeculum, because again, people aren't going to know anything about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, so a Saeculum is it's the average lifetime of a human being. Okay, so 80 years, obviously, and so that's the during the human lifetime. Okay, this is part of their thesis, is that over the course of a human lifetime, there are, generally speaking, 4 turnings. Okay, and obviously those don't perfectly line up with every life, but that's the idea. So when we think of Saeculums, and this is one of the difficulties of examining history, and they don't really get into this in the book, and so this isn't a critique of the book necessarily, but they we tend to look at history through the lens of our own lives. Okay, and so it's hard for us sometimes to I should say it is hard. That the task a lot of times when we look at history is to try to understand events in the context in which they were occurring, and so it's easy for us to sit here and look back on our fathers, grandfathers, and judge them for the things that they were doing or allowing to happen or whatever. But what we have to keep in mind is, in 80 years, people are going to be looking back on us doing the same thing, right? How could they dare let that happen? And so I think when we think Saeculums, we just think, hey, this is the average lifetime, and we're in the middle of a Saeculum, and that Saeculum has the ability to look back on other Saeculums, and it's easy to point out times and places where people were wrong, but we've got our own challenges to work through ourselves, and we're, as much as we want to be right, and that's admirable, we're not right about a lot of things. So I think another thing that has been helpful to me is so look at many Saeculums together. Okay, so and put Saeculums together. So in other words, people are like, oh man, and a lot of folks in religious circles that I'm in, they want to always talk about the end times. right?
Hmm.
So the end of the world is near. The Lord is returning soon, right? Christ is coming back, and this, it's all going to be a big, battle and all this. Well, okay, what I want to say to, and not just Christians, but people in general is, um, so let's say there's, instead of looking at history in terms of your lifetime, think of history in terms of 500-year blocks.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's start with the year zero. Okay,
Hmm.
AD zero. Jesus has just passed away. Would you rather be alive in the year zero or the year 500? Okay, most people would say, well, all things considered, 500, right? Okay, 500 to 1,000. Well, okay, I'll take 1,000, right? And so things may look difficult today, and they are. It's not that we're not saying it's not difficult, but to your point earlier, things are progressing. Okay, I mean, obviously, you would rather be alive today in the year 2020 than you would be in the year 2,000
Hmm.
years ago. But um, but there are cycles of history that do tend to play out the same, and the reason that they do is because of the generational patterns that I think are embedded in the creation of man, in the history of man. I think there's theological stuff to that. I think there's things that are embedded in creation that God did, that bring these cycles about, and that are part of His plan. So anyway.
I think you're onto something there. Strauss and Howe talk about Moses because they go all the way back to the Old
Yep.
Testament, and they talk about how when Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt, right? And it's interesting. I do the Bible in a year, and we just finished Genesis, and now moved on to Exodus, right? And besides the facts of the Israelites grumbling and wanting to fall back into a tyranny.
Yeah.
um
Take us, make us slaves again.
right. Well, but
But
I
I've
mean,
been there. I've been there,
it was so great when we had those golden handcuffs.
Yeah.
um one of the points that Strauss and Howe makes is that Moses, as a leader, the reason he was long lived, and they don't go into the religious aspects because this is not a religious book, or theological aspects, but they don't, because it's not a theological book. But
Right.
what they say is, and they kind of skim close to the top and they move away from it. But what they say is basically, because Moses died at 120 years old,
Mm-hmm.
he was allowed to live long enough to see the beginning of the next Secular,
Mm-hmm.
and to provide leadership through the beginning of the next Saeculum, in order to set up the descendants of those who came out of tyranny and slavery, so
Yeah.
that they could actually enter the promised land with Joshua and do the things in the book of Deuteronomy this is talked about, and do the things that they actually needed to do in order to have and experience a high. Moses was a problem solver,
That's
and the
good.
Lord allowed him to live long enough to be one. And so I thought that was a really interesting point that Strauss and Howe made.
Mm.
Um, so we talk about sort of this idea of the archetypes, right? Progressive, missionary, lost, and GI, right? The artist, the prophet, the nomad, and the hero.
Right.
And Strauss and Howe postulate that these archetypes all have certain roles that they have to play in the Saeculum, regardless of how they may feel about it at a group level. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Because the hero archetype being attached to sort of millennials kind of gives us pause, but we could easily attach the hero archetype to the GI generation of World War II.
Yeah. So, it's interesting, as when you think about each one of these archetypes,
Mm-hmm.
and I know people. Part of this is what a lot of folks call in ministry is powdered butt syndrome. Okay, so so in other words, you don't like to take advice from anybody whose butt you've powdered.
Right.
Okay, and so there's a tendency of one generation to sort of look down on a subsequent generation, right? Like, there's no way they know what they're talking about. There's no way, and so there's just some of that, okay, in every generation. And so, but what I think millennials have, and you alluded to this earlier, is they have numbers.
Mm-hmm.
They have numbers, and I think it's interesting. that we're the nomad generation, right? And so, according to the book, like we're always downstream from crisis, right? We're in the middle of the unraveling, and we just have to stay alive, right?
That's it. That's our only job.
We've got our chops. We earned our stripes. Hey, these millennials, they never got spanked. None of this stuff. Or thumped in the ear or squeezed in the arm or whatever, however your parents did that. But what's interesting about the millennial generation is, as you know, the Gen Xers, there's just not many of us.
Right.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, abortion came online in 1972. So right in the middle of it's not like the baby boomers weren't having sex. I mean, they were. It's just abortion took out 40 million of us. I mean, a lot in those intervening years. And so I think, that tapered off some. Abortion has, I think it's still bad. It's still happening, and there's a lot, but the millennials are a much larger generation. They would be a lot larger without abortion access, with that abortion going on. But I will say that the millennials, because of their numbers, and we'll get into this a little bit in the Zeihan book, they are going to provide the economic powerhouse that Gen Z has not been able to provide, just because we don't have the numbers.
Or Gen X, you mean?
Yeah, Gen X. I'm sorry, Gen X. We just don't have the numbers to contribute the way that certainly not the baby boomers have. And so while other nations are having demographic decline, I mean, the millennials are going to step in here and be able to pick up the slack in a lot of ways.
Well, millennials are now in their early 40s. House buying has started to tick up among well over 50% of millennials. Child making, if you look at social media, has begun to tick up. I don't know how many children they're having. We'll know by not the next census, but the census after that. Should the Lord tarry, we'll know by the census after that how many children the millennials have actually had. And it's an interesting point that you make about Gen X, because yes, they are the smallest generation just by demographic numbers. I believe there's only like 25 to 30 million or something like that, which is a drop in the bucket in comparison to other generations, both on either side of them. And I think you mentioned abortion. I think you also have to mention the twin chemical scourge of the pill.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
You can count all those babies that were aborted for sure, but what about all the babies that were never even allowed to be fertilized and conceived?
That's right.
So we have,
and that was the baby boomer generation that came about in, and so so there would be a huge drop off in child making. Yep, absolutely.
Right. Yep. Okay, so we've got our idea set up here from the fourth turning. Let's look at demographics, because we mentioned Zeihan now twice. So Peter Zeihan is a geopolitical strategist and a guy who is not a political rightist or a political leftist. He claims he's more to the political center. I would maybe frame him as more of a center leftist, honestly. Yep. But that doesn't mean he's wrong.
Nope.
And he's written 3 books, actually 4 books, all of which are focused around these 2 twin ideas, geography and demography. Now, he's not a geographic and demographic determinist 100%, but I would say, unlike Jared Diamond, who wrote the book Guns, Germs, and Steel many years ago, I would say that Zeihan is definitely leaning in the direction of being a demographic determinist. This is a guy who called the collapse of Chinese demography. This is a guy who has tracked demographic patterns and demographic trends, and he has the data to prove it over the course of the last 30 years, not just in the United States, but across the globe where industrialization has touched. And his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization, makes a bold postulation. And the bold postulation is this: the global geopolitical, trade, military, and even social order that America set up at the end of World War II, ironically enough, at the beginning of the current Saeculum we are now at the end of, 80 years ago, that global order that was set up at Bretton Woods is now coming apart. And we can see that everywhere. I mean, look, Donald Trump showed up in 2017, 2018, and basically asked Angela Merkel, who at the time was the prime minister of Germany, why the Germans weren't paying their fair share in NATO. And John McCain, the former senator from Arizona, he asked the question out loud, why would anyone question the world order? We set it up. It's working out really well for us. Shut your mouth. Well, Donald Trump didn't shut his mouth because he can't. He just tweeted consistently. And he still continues. Well, no, he doesn't continue to tweet anymore. He has his own thing now, got Truth Social over there. But Donald Trump basically asked a question that I have been asking about globalization, at least since I began understanding how all of this stuff came together. I understand a lot about Bretton Woods and how that argument came together. And America did do a thing at the end of World War II that no other major power has ever done in the history of the world.
Yeah.
They said to the people who were defeated, we don't want to invade you. We don't want to put military bases on your land. We don't even really want to be here. But we'll protect the shipping lanes and will allow you to have access to the American markets because all of your markets are bombed out and depleted. That one offer, which was an offer that, quite frankly, everybody in Western Europe couldn't believe, all those former colonialists couldn't believe was happening to them. Well, they all jumped at it and ran. And that set the tone for where we are at now. It set the tone for the decline of the American blue-collar workforce. As I framed it sometimes for business school students when I used to teach at business school, a deal was struck that it would be okay for a Chinese laborer to go from making 10 cents a year to making $1 a year, as long as a bunch of workers in Indiana who are making $25 an hour could take it in the neck for the next 30 years. That was the deal. And of course, nobody explained it to the American worker in that way, but that was the deal. Now, in exchange for that, we got cheap Nikes and cheap auto parts, and in some cases, cheap automobiles. But we also got a service-based economy. We got jobs that were no longer guaranteed. And of course, we got many other cultural, moral, and spiritual crises that went along from the crack cocaine problems in the inner city ghettos of America, all the way to Lyndon Johnson trying to fix everything with the Great Society. All of that came about because of the Bretton Woods agreements that were signed at the end of World War II. And Zeihan makes all of these points in his book. But then he goes a little bit further and he says, listen, America is done protecting the shipping lanes and the global order is going to collapse. And when it does, and by the way, we are already seeing this in real time right now in the Red Sea, when it does, all of the bad old days that were occurring before World War I even are going to come back, and we might want to get ready because now all the pirates have access to suitcase nukes. Okay. I think I kind of summarized Zeihan's basic argument in The End of the World is Just the Beginning, the demographic trends, and the collapse of the globalized order. By the way, when most people talk about this, and I've heard Zeihan twice on Joe Rogan, Rogan freaks out about this, which as a good secular materialist would. Zeihan does not look at religion or the impact of culture at all. And I think because the reason he doesn't is because he's a consultant in the political and geopolitical space. And so his clients are looking for answers they can wrap their arms around and measure with ones and zeros because they're looking to make revenue. They're not looking for the intangible things which drive the ones and zeros. So I turned Bagley onto Zeihan, and he's taking a look at that book. So what did you think of Peter's thesis, and what did he miss? Because you and I had a conversation with this a little bit about this offline. What has Zeihan missed in his analysis of demography and geography?
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you for turning me on to that book because it was a great read. It really was. And love him or hate him, one thing you cannot say is Peter Zeihan is not a really smart dude.
He's a really smart dude.
He's a really
Yes.
smart guy, and he's fun to listen to. I did the audiobook route, and it's almost like you're just having a conversation with him and listening to him talk. And he did a great job with that book. But so first
By the
off,
way, he's a classic Gen Xer too. By the way, he is a classic Gen Xer.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. And so he did a lot of good things in that book. I think and I don't want to pick on him at all because I do have a lot of respect for him. But I will say this: we live in a very materialistic world, and I think that's one of the, to go back to the fourth turning, I think one of the things that we're coming out of and into this in this new Saeculum, I think there's going to be a renewed interest. Well, there already is a renewed interest in the things that are spiritual. Okay, now the one thing I will say is that doesn't mean, that's not a foregone conclusion that what is spiritual is Christian.
Right.
And so that's one of the great dangers. And I think that's one of the things we're going to be fighting is interest in demonic or the occult or, just whatever, mystic things, whatever, things that are very harmful. But so all that being said, he's writing this purely from a materialistic, I say purely, mostly from a materialistic understanding of geography. And, it's almost like in some ways he's a geographical determinist. I don't want to say that he's 100%, but he does emphasize the huge role that geography has played over the course of history, and of course the Bretton Woods Agreement and all these things. And one of the things that I mentioned was, he talks about the rivers of the United States and the rivers of Germany and all the natural deep ports that we have here in America and all these great, wonderful advantages geographically, which are true, absolutely true. But we've also had a theological advantages that have helped us tremendously. I mean, think about, the Europeans were not the first ones to America. Like there were native people here for decades, and yet they were not able to harness those same resources in ways that brought about the current situation, right? And so I think there's something that Zeihan might be missing. He is missing is sort of a theological understanding of how these things played out. Why did certain parts of the world get their wealth? And I'm not saying only Christian societies have ever been successful. That's not what I'm saying. But to get back to your point earlier, politics is downstream of culture. Culture is downstream from religion. I mean, what a person believes about the world, about themselves, about who God is, and why they exist, that determines the culture that you live in vastly. It makes it.
Well, and it's interesting that you would mention the awakening pieces that I think are happening. I agree with you. I think that the next great awakening, which is going to come on the other side of the back end of the next high, I think it's going to start growing steam in the next high that's coming up. Right. I would say like 2030 to 2050. And then on the back side of that is when you're going to see, I think, a combination of techno-paganism and some weird mysticism. And I'm already starting to see some conversations in places that I wouldn't necessarily have thought were going to happen, in places that I would not have necessarily thought to see these conversations around, well, that whole Jesus thing isn't working out, so maybe we should just worship Odin.
Right.
Or maybe we should just worship nature. And by the way, I do believe that in the secular materialist world, climate change is the Christianity that stands in.
Yes.
And I think we're not quite done with that cargo cult set of beliefs, because it takes a long time for people to give up their worldviews. It takes a long time for them to see sometimes it takes a lifetime for people to see the ultimate end of their worldviews. This is something that I've pointed out with Marxism. Anybody who was born after 1950, I don't want to hear anything that you have to say in support of Marxism, because Marxism has been tried. It's been tried all the way to its end, and it's done. And so if you were born after 1952 and you can't see that, I don't know how to help you. Now, if you were born, before 1952, you probably didn't know how bad Marxism was going to be, because it hadn't been fully tried and it hadn't been fully vetted yet in the politics and in the culture. I think paganism, I think we're going to have a return to some of the old school forms of paganism, like the Greek, Roman, and Norse gods, combined with AI. And the paganism has been tried. And this is what the Catholic Church understood. Camilie Paglia mentions this a lot in her book, Sexual Personae, when she talks about how basically the arts have been in constant tension with the church. But the church, early church fathers, absolutely understood the power of the pagan and pagan beliefs and nature-based beliefs. And so they were seeking to stamp a lot of that out or hold it all down. And Camille Paglia's point is, and I think it's a well-founded one, is that this bursts out in all kinds of places like poetry, visual arts, things like that. And I think we're going to see that, but I think the full flowering of that in our time is going to come through artificial intelligence and large language models. And it'll probably happen when I'm an old man and I'll be screaming at the sky saying, "Don't do this," because I just came out of the last crisis and no one will pay attention.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say all those things, because there was a video circulating on social media at the World Economic Forum, and there were several bigwigs on a stage. I don't know who they were exactly, but there was a shaman who got up and gave like some kind of spiritual, it was a native person. I don't know if it was a Native American or South American somebody, but it was a shaman, clearly a shaman, gives this cultic chant, and then goes over and blows some kind of something on each one of the participants on this panel, right? And so you're absolutely right. We are careening towards a reintroduction of the spiritual. The problem, though, is what kind of spiritual, and
right.
It's an embrace of paganism. And there's another book called The Age of Anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, I'm sorry, it's An Anxious Age, and it's by a philosopher named Joseph Bottom, who's a Catholic philosopher. I don't know if you've heard of him or not, but he wrote this book, and it talks about how when Americans kind of forsook their Christian, their Protestant heritage, if you will, they still retained this desire to be righteous, right? Mm-hmm. There's this religious void inside of us, and so whether it is, we need to worship something. We need to be absolved of our sins that we all know we're guilty of, and so there's this hunger for religion. And in his book, he talks about, and he's written essays on this too, but he talks about that all of the isms. So you mentioned environmentalism. All of these isms take a very religious form. Okay,
mm-hmm.
So there's an original sin involved in environmentalism. There's a path to salvation, right? There's there's an eschatology, right? Mm-hmm. This is how the world will end if we do nothing, right? All of these, pick your ism, doesn't matter. It is a form of religion that humans embrace to absolve themselves of their guilt. And so I think, take this World Economic Forum case, right? So you have all these rich people sitting in Davos. They're not religious. They're enjoying the fruits of a Christian heritage, what the Christian West brought about in the world, the culmination of Bretton Woods and all this mm-hmm. wealth and money that came from all of that. They don't know what to do with it because they've kind of forsaken that religious heritage, and so they've got to turn to something. And so, well, I'm guilty that these natives don't have what I have, so let's let them be our religious leaders. And what they don't understand, though, is that's careening them toward something horrific later, much later.
Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. Yeah, worldviews do matter. History matters. Worldview matters. I would make the claim, if you were going to make a hierarchical ladder, worldviews and beliefs in religious systems matter the most because that's the transcendent thing you put at the top, right. And then everything else, or the headwaters, and then everything else follows from that. Back to Zeihan for just a second. As a materialist, one of the things he points out is that because America has all these natural advantages and our demography is not as far off the cliff as other countries, in particular, looking at Gen Z, I believe there's something like 65 or 75 million folks in the Gen Z generation, which is all the individuals who were born between 1997 and 2017. There's a lot of them. I think they're either the second or third largest generation, not counting the boomers, in our culture today. And he does have a podcast, and I've listened to it a couple times. It's short little clips where he talks about things. Never listened to the audiobook of him, though. I imagine it's probably the exact same as listening to him on the podcast. But he makes the point that because our demography hasn't fallen off as much, we will survive many of the regional shocks. And he makes this point too, in The End of the World is just the beginning. We will survive many of the regional shocks that will come about because of the world coming apart. So for instance, here's a regional shock. Yep. China's demography is falling apart. They will be under 1 billion people by the end of this century, if not quicker. With China's demography falling apart, the real estate collapse of Evergrande that occurred this year makes a lot more sense. But then from that, you get into the Communist Party of China having to make a couple of different decisions, neither of which are good. They could either reform and become more democratic, which they won't do, or they will become more authoritarian and totalitarian, and by tightening the grip, will become a continent-sized version of North Korea. That's the only two options that Zeihan sees. Now, I throw a third option in there, and by the way, you mentioned Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson turned me on to Zeihan. He wrote an entire article, and I'll have a link to that article in the podcast on his blog and Bay blog. And I watched the video of it too, where he talks about what the role of Christian missionaries are to these dark corners of the world. So going back to the China example, the role of a Christian missionary going to a China where Chinese Christians are under a North Korea level totalitarian boot, that American missionary, that bright-eyed 19-year-old with the gospel, is going to have a different sort of attitude going into those spaces. Whereas right now, the attitude is, if I go as a Christian missionary, yeah, I mean, it might be a little bit tight, but the American government is going to come get me. Like the American government came and got the hostages most recently in the current version of the Israeli-Palestinian war, okay, that Hamas kidnapped. bunch of people. The Americans got out because the American government, the tacit agreement between America and its citizens is, if you're in trouble somewhere, we'll come get you. But if America's not manning the shipping lanes, and if China falls apart, in the China example that I just mentioned, an American missionary goes to China, the answer from the American government might be, well, good luck. We're not going to come get you. And so how does the American church respond to that? How do we prepare our bright-eyed 19-year-olds to basically be like Navy SEALs yeah, when they may not be wired that way? And then he also doubled down, Wilson did, and he said, listen, and this is him punching to the right again, punching like St. Paul, punching to believers. The American church is not currently constructed to be able to equip people in that way, because the American church is still myopically focused on things that don't matter, right. Particularly the left-leaning American church. I think that Zeihan is correct in his analysis of demographics in that respect.
Yep.
I also think that Wilson is correct in that respect of thinking about how we do the Christian outreach. But I think there's something that both of them are missing. And I think the thing that both of them are missing is that none of this works, to your point, if America falls apart. And that's what we're teeter-tottering on the precipice of, and have been, by the way, since 2020. Everybody knows, both left, right, and politically centered, that we are more politically polarized than ever before. That happens during a crisis period. We know that we have many, many problems, and here are some of them in no rank order. The decline of spiritual, moral, and ethical meaning, the fractured nature of familial relations, the splintering of definitional roles for men and women, the inability to appropriately organize a hierarchy of problems, much less solutions, the inability to appropriately order problems that are actually solvable versus the ones that aren't, the intransigence of human sin, including our inability and unwillingness to identify what is sinful and what is not, which, by the way, used to be the role of the church. And the church has, at least some parts of the American church have completely abandoned that. Not all, not the church I go to, not the church that Brian Bagley was a pastor of, but many churches have abandoned that. The complexity of economic life, and I don't mean the complexity as in the complexity of decisions. I mean the complexity of what is the good here, and not knowing how to define that. The tension between freedom and tyranny, which was exposed with COVID. And of course, our overwhelming desire to revisit a past that never was and can never be again. So our nostalgia is killing us too. These are our problems in the West. And I think Zeihan and Strauss, because these problems are so big, Zeihan, Strauss, and Howe focused on obviously the tiniest things they could focus on. But in a crisis, everything comes to bear. And then you throw in the internet with that. And the internet just allows me to connect with a kid in Mississippi or a disgruntled mom in California. And now I have community, even though I'm in Texas. I have community with someone in California who's disgruntled. I have community with someone in Mississippi who is disgruntled. I have community with someone in Michigan who's disgruntled, who can't get the attention of politicians who we've elected as leaders to fix our problems. And so now a local problem in Michigan or California or Mississippi or Texas gets scaled up to being a national problem. And this is where the country comes apart.
Yep.
And of course, the worshiping of ideologies and isms, which you've already talked about. So how do we, I think I know how we got here.
Mm-hmm.
You know how we got here. We've had conversations about this before. But how I deep in my heart, I wanted to start a podcast called How We Got Here, and just lay out for people, just maybe that's a project we work on together, but just lay out for people in episode after episode, step by step, politically, theologically, culturally, morally, spiritually. How do we, because I don't think people put all of that together. They just look at their one little corner like Zeihan and Strauss and Howe do, and they miss everything else, but it's all together at this moment. And I think we sense that in our gut, but we don't know what the way out is, and that paralyzes us even further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's good. There's going back to your comment, you're talking about China and the demographic bomb that they're facing.
Yeah.
That is going to go off, and it is going to be
Oh, it's
terrible.
already gone off. It's
Yeah,
already gone off. They don't even report their demographic numbers anymore. It's already gone off.
yeah, yeah. And and Zeihan, his predictions, they may that very well may happen. Okay, but like what about all the Christian Chinese that are there right now, right? I
Right.
mean, so there's and he doesn't account for that. And so there right now there are estimates that there are more Christians in China than there are people living in North America,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so and you're right to your point about social media. These people are connected. They're not. And now obviously China is a statist country. They can they control social media. There's all kinds of crackdowns, but don't think for a second that people aren't, networking. They don't know who the Christians are, and so there's going to be there's going to be a crucible. There's going to be a sifting, I think, in Chinese culture. How will it turn out? I don't know, but I think there's a religious factor that is going to play in a very large way. Again, I have no idea how it's going to turn out, but just to say all that to say, is China is going to go through a very dark age, but I think it's very possible that they emerge from that dark age in a very good place. It's possible that could happen.
So if I'm hearing this, I go, okay, that's cool for China, but I speak English and I'm in Texas.
Yes.
What are we going to do here? Because I ain't never met those people. So what are we going to do? How do we stay together here?
Yeah.
Like I said, we're more polarized than ever before. How do we stay together? And I have some thoughts on this, but I want to hear what some of your thoughts are. How do we stay together here in our own backyard? I mean, currently, as of this recording, the Texas Border Patrol is, basically Governor Abbott found his Andrew Jackson button. And so he's pressing that and leaning on that. And he is benefited by having a president who is doddering. And by the way, that's a gentle term, doddering, and doesn't really quite know where he is in a Palace of Versailles type situation where no one in Washington, D.C. or Hunger Games, if you kids don't know history who are listening, who don't know what they're doing other than draining tribute from the populace. And so how do we hold the 50 states together here? Because and by the way, 25 other governors have said that they support Abbott as of this recording. That may have changed by the time you hear this. But and by the way, the two biggest states that didn't say anything have been California and New York. They've been mum silent.
Who have been getting their faces kicked in by all this illegal immigration.
Nothing to say about any of it. And so here's a challenge question for you. How do we as civic leaders, as individuals, as families, how do we hold the republic together? Because I think the high is coming in about 4 or 5, maybe outside 10 years. But how do we hold together for that long? How do we not come apart at the seams?
Yeah. So I think that's such a good question. And I think it's all about building relationships locally where you are. Now, I don't want to discount what's the phenomenon that's happening on social media right now, because to your point, and you said people are making connections. Here I'm in Texas and I'm listening to this guy in Moscow, Idaho, who's encouraging me in the middle of coronavirus lockdown, all that mess. And we're almost a continent away, right? And so I think that there is a place for that. I think that there is going to be, to the extent that social media companies take the Elon Musk route, right, and don't lock everybody up, and put people in jail for whatever, for violating some mindless rule. I think that will be a source of encouragement. I think there'll be some resources shared via the internet, but I think where where the rubber meets the road is in your local area. And so like and I mean I used to talk with a guy who was a Republican county chair there in Hood County, and he used to always tell me, "Hey, politics is local. Politics is local. The local elections matter more than the national elections." And to a large extent, that's right. I mean, so I mean, if you think about it, any resistance to authoritarianism has to come from the lower levels. So you see that with Abbott and Biden, right? Mm-hmm. So you appeal to the lesser magistrate, right? So you've got a president who's AWOL, who's not enforcing the laws, and so Governor Abbott is appealing to the Constitution, right, which is the highest magistrate of the land. The U.S. Constitution is higher than the president. The president pledges allegiance to the Constitution as the highest magistrate, and so he, as the lesser magistrate, right, he appeals to the Constitution and says, "Hey, you've got this intermediary here, the president, who's in the way. He's actually not upholding. He's an errant." A wrong-headed magistrate. And so I think it's going to play out that way as well, right? So in your local area, like your county judge needs to be someone who is trustworthy, right? Because if something happens at the state level or the national level or the sheriff, right? So that the county judge and the sheriff and the local police chief, right? Those are going to be the guys that come knocking on doors, right? Or manning checkpoints at the city gates, keeping the feds out, right? Or whatever it is. So, so I think those local elections matter a lot, and building rapport and local networks, I think, are very important.
Well, I think once you saw this where the Federal Border Patrol basically came out and said, "We've seen what's happening at the border, and our rank and file are going to back Texas. So everybody chill out." And I think that I'm going to be gentle here. I think the 1,000 tyrants, 5,000 miles away, once they lose the shock troops, I'm not going to say they're done, but I'm going to say that it becomes infinitely harder to implement certain things.
Right.
I think that the way in which folks were treated who had 15 and 20-year careers in the military around COVID, who were uninterested in taking the shot, and were bounced out of the military by the Biden administration, combine that with the bungled Afghanistan retreat, I think left a sour taste in a lot of rank and file folks' mouths. And this is from the NCO level on down.
Yep.
Anything above NCO level, those folks are political, and they're going to go to all of the transgender white rage, sessions all day. But they don't actually know how to fire the weapons, and they don't actually know how to man the ships, and they don't actually know how to fly the helicopters or drive the tanks. They know political tactics, not military ones. Okay. That's my thought. That's my thinking. That's not anything coming from Brian. That's me thinking, or that's my thought. But I think once you lose the rank and file, you're done. Like you don't have anybody to go with. I also think, to your point, that our actions have to be the culmination of 1 million ants. So I've never told this story before, ever. I haven't told the story to my kids, but one time when I was a kid, my house was swarmed by fire ants where I lived. And it doesn't matter what state I lived in. It was swarmed by fire ants. I don't know what got them upset. I don't know what got them outraged, but and I remember, I have a distinct memory. It might've been when I was maybe 9 years old, of the fire ants just covering my house. And my grandma was at home, and we were at home, and we were trying to deal with it. She was trying to get the ants out of the house. And literally they were everywhere, right? And you're like running around trying to like stomp ants. And apparently this occasionally, the area where I lived in, where I grew up, this occasionally happens. And it was one of those traumatic incidents that sort of imprinted itself in my brain. I never went to therapy for it. It doesn't, whatever. I'm fine. Thank you, folks. Please keep your money. I'm Gen X. We don't care. That was a dandy, and why?
Yeah, that was just part of that. Was just we called that Tuesday, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's okay. Yes, we were tougher. Yes, we are tougher because we just had to be. But but I when every time we talk, or as we talking about this, I'm remembering this story because, or remembering this thing that happened to me, because I remember seeing just how fast all those ants moved once they got going in a particular direction. And I think that's how we hold the Republic together. But I think it has to be in multiple different areas. And I already said, I want to kind of go back to this a little bit. I do see things shifting and changing. And this is why I'm on leadership so much, because ants will swarm, but in that swarm, there's always a leader. Actually, there's several leaders. Now, you can't see it from the outside because it looks like just like a wiggling mass, but they are following a path. They are following a trail. Culturally, which again, as we've already stated before, culture is always downstream from people with appropriate worldviews. And people with appropriate worldviews are the ones that you want to be in leadership positions, particularly at a local level. Countries have been in crises before, and typically one of three things happen. Either leadership never shows up and the country collapses. We've seen that in history. The leadership just doesn't manifest, and the ants have nowhere to go, and they wind up eating each other, and it's done, right? The second option is that leadership does show up, but it's corrupt and the country collapses. So this is Rome, the British Empire, Muslim empires, the Ottoman Empire, Greek empires. I mean, any empires in history, you could point to where the corruption happened, and you could say this series of bad emperors or this series of bad leaders. And I was wont to say in the early 2000s that, particularly with George Bush's election, it kind of struck me as a young man that we are now entering the time of bad emperors. That was one of the first things I thought. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh, here we go. We're in our Roman Empire phase with emperors. Great. This is going to be an adventure. And then the third thing that typically happens is that leadership shows up and it's good, but not great. And it's too late and the country collapses. Well, we've already had corruption, and we can see that. And we've already had leadership not showing up. I find it interesting that our current Fed chairman is talking now about adults in the room. And I'm looking at people going, we hired you. You're the adult. Actually, we didn't hire you. We have no control over that. You're supposed to be the adult. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Janet Yellen, who's an older adult, came along and was like, oh, no, everything's fine. There's nothing to see here. There's nothing behind the curtain. I think many of the ants are afraid that leadership will show up. Good leadership, not great, but good enough leadership will show up and it'll be too late. I think that's the fear. Kind of like Gandalf showed up late with King Theoden in Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And had to get Wormtongue out of there, right? Are we at a spot culturally where it's too late? I personally don't think so, but I'm not seeing what you're seeing.
So, so we live in an age where hierarchy is despised. We live in an egalitarian moment, right? And so we have to smash structures of authority, tear it all down, right? We want parallel. And so the moment that we need hierarchy, the moment where we need and I understand, like, you're absolutely right. Like, and I think people are maybe reacting to unrighteous hierarchy in the past. Okay, that's fine. But the solution is not to smash the hierarchy, smash the patriarchy, smash the whatever people say these days, however they're saying it and communicating it. It's let's destroy hierarchies. The solution is to seek leaders, like you're talking about, leaders who are who are righteous, leaders who are humble, leaders who can listen, and that doesn't mean, and listening doesn't mean doing even the will of the people, right? I mean, sometimes mobs are wrong. Sometimes mobs are terrible, but there's a famous parable, not a parable. There's a famous scene in the New Testament where Jesus is he's ministering, and a Roman centurion comes to him and says, "Hey, I have a child who's sick," and Jesus is like, "Well, where is he? Let's go to him." And the Roman soldier says, "No, no, no, it's okay. I too am a man under authority. So you just give the word, and I know that it'll be done, that he'll be healed." And so, and Jesus is like, I mean, his response is like, "Whoa, like this guy understands hierarchy. Like he knows I can just give a command to one of my angels, and that angel will be dispatched, and that sickness will be sent, the way of the dodo bird." So, I think there's got to be a recovery at some point. There's got to be a recovery of hierarchy, and not just any hierarchy, but a hierarchy that values humanity, that values God, that values the things that will build society. Right now, we're in a moment where it's almost like an anti-human moment. The institutions that we need to help us get through this moment of crisis are being torn down. Now, some of them need to be torn down. Okay, and I'm not saying that all institutions should carry on indefinitely, but the task at hand is to rebuild those institutions well, to equip, in my mind as a Gen Xer, how do I equip millennials and Gen Z? I'm raising Gen Zers, okay? So how do I equip them to step into leadership, to not accept poor leadership, but to step into leadership knowing that they may not be the top guy, but to embrace hierarchy and embrace your place in the hierarchy. Like, just because you're not the top does not mean you're less. It just means you have a different role to play, and be content with that role and embrace that role.
One of the things that Zeihan notes in his book, and Strauss and Howe kind of glide over it, they don't really touch on it. But one of the things that Zeihan notes quite strongly in his book is that as prosperity increases in general in a country, the number of people being born decreases, and the level of spiritual satisfaction and meaning decreases as well. Now, at a materialistic level, this is chalked up to women having more agency, thus they can tell men to go away, and they don't have to have 12 kids anymore. Now they can all be on birth control and use abortions. And in every country where we've exported this to, those countries have watched their birth rates drop. Yes, their material prosperity has increased, but in general, there has been dissatisfaction. And because the cycles between the acquisition of prosperity, Zeihan talks about this, but the acquisition of prosperity through globalization and the demographic collapse, the cycles between those two poles have gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. Those poles have gotten closer and closer as globalization has spread. And of course, other countries, notably countries that are more overtly theocratic than the United States, i.e., Iran, or Turkey, or India, have sought to fight these, and Russia, interestingly enough, have sought to fight these demographic declines by making appeals, as Vladimir Putin did, to Russian women to have more babies. So I guess here's a challenge question for you, because I've never been able to figure this out myself. Why do those things, and Zeihan has no answer either, why is it that when material prosperity increases, demographics drop off? Why do both of those things seem to go together like bread and butter? Because it seems as though as the material prosperity increases, you would actually want to have more children because you're able to actually afford them. But it seems as though the opposite actually happens. Children are seen as a luxury good. You see this in Japan and in South Korea, where no one's having kids. Like they're just not, right? And so, I mean, you even have a situation in Japan right now where men and women are literally virgins meeting each other, even though they have access to pornography and virtual reality, this and AI that, right? But there's literally no contact between men and women. Okay, and Japan is just the highest pinnacle of this that you can see in the world. Why do those two things go together? I've never really understood that. What's the spiritual underpinning of that?
Yeah, so a lot of people have tried to make the connection between prosperity and childbearing. I don't know that is so much a connection as it is just a coincidence, maybe. That we live in an affluent time, but we also live in a time where people are not having children. There's probably some connection there. I think there's a definite drop in Christian morality, and so I mean, like it or not, this was a Christian nation. I know people don't like to say that, or whatever, but the majority of people who came here were Protestants from Europe. There were some Catholics that came along, and a very small amount of Jews, but it was mainly Protestants, and that Protestant ethic came here, and that Protestant ethic was very family centered. It was in some ways, it was very covenantal. And covenantal Christianity is all about it's generational. And so there was a very strong generational push. Well, as secularization begins to take over, the word secular means now. Secularism is now-ism. And so as people begin to focus on the here and now, they're not thinking generationally, they're not thinking down the road, they're not thinking about their grandkids, great-grandkids, or beyond that. The one great thing about Christianity that I'll say is, well, there's many great things, but one in particular, Christianity is is the only religion that is forward thinking. Okay, like in other words, if I belong to any other religion, I have to look back on my life and hope that it was good enough. Okay, Christianity is the one religion where I look forward knowing that my past was not good enough. I look forward to Christ. Paul says in Philippians 3, he says, I forget what lies behind and I press on toward the upward call of Christ. No other religion is saying that. They're saying, well, we hope you followed the eightfold path. I hope you kept the 5 pillars of Islam. I hope you did whatever, right? It's always backward looking. And so I think with this rise of secularism, this rise of now-ism, we're so focused on the here and now. We're so focused on making money, but we don't stop and think, what are the implications of this long term? And I think part of, to answer your question, I think if we can sort of break this hold that secularism has, and I'm hopeful that going forward that there's a lot of efforts I think underway, and I think a lot of folks are waking up to the idea that, hey, you know what, the Bible is actually right on sexuality. The Bible is actually right on what constitutes human suffering and versus human flourishing. And there's an embrace of online. I saw somebody going on and on. I mean, all these memes about trad wife, right? Like trying to recover the whole, and I don't want people to get caught up on trad wife, but the point is why do people exist? Why? Why did God make man and woman? And he gave them 2 tasks. He said, your task is fill the earth and subdue it. That's it.
That's
like,
it.
Fill the earth and subdue it. And so subduing the earth produces wealth. Mm-hmm. Like it does. Like when you subdue the earth, value is added to the earth. Mm-hmm. And then filling the earth. But the only way to do that is with people. Like you need more people to make more wealth, to subdue the earth. And so So I don't know that there's a direct correlate. I think properly understood, child rearing breeds more wealth. Having children should increase a society's wealth, if that makes sense.
I think Elon Musk would agree with you, and that guy's doing his level best to increase the human population, one woman at a time. Probably not for definitely not for religious motives, for more secular motives. But he's come to the same. I believe he's come to the same clearing at the end of the path that we have. You know, as you talk, I'm reminded of the line from the Catholic theologian and apologist. Not theologian, Catholic apologist G.K. Chesterton, who, by the way, his star has risen among Protestants as things have become worse and worse, because he called a lot of this, as the Catholics usually do.
Yeah.
But
Love my Catholic friends.
Yeah, well, Chesterton once quipped, it isn't that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It's that Christianity has been tried and found too hard and been abandoned. And that's the dead truth. And so you talk about secularism being now-ism. I loved it how you framed that, because if the Luciferian deceit of focusing on the now, and the now being the thing I consume, and you talk about memes, I see this now all over the place, particularly in the red-pilled community and folks who are particularly masculine folks, both men and women, who are seeking to return to some form of patriarchy, but they are backwards looking, not forwards looking. They're not making plans to the future. But you see this idea in them and in their memes, this idea that, you know, a person who is consuming sports and video games and took the COVID shot and believes whatever it is that the major media tells them, and just moves from consuming to consuming to consuming to consuming to consuming, is held up. And folks like themselves, folks who would produce trad wife memes, are seen as being antithetical to the hierarchical system, because they don't want to play the game. If Doug Wilson were here, he'd say the answer to everything is Jesus, as would you. And I agree. The answer to everything is Jesus. Unfortunately, we live in a reality of getting people over the hump of their secularism to Jesus. And so 12 disciples managed to figure this out with less technology than we had. They just had a walking stick and their words. Okay. How is it we can't figure this out in America? We have so much available wealth. This is why I use the podcast to do what I do. We have so much available wealth to us, and yet we don't seem, or maybe it's a 1 million ant situation. Maybe I'm only looking at this one little group and I'm not seeing everything else. But it seems as though we do not have nearly enough folks, and I'm not talking about the theologians of the G.K. Chesterton types. I'm talking about the average person being willing to, lose their job or lose their position in a neighborhood, or lose their position on some church council or church community to speak truth to people in a way that's necessary in order to get Jesus into them and to expand, to paraphrase Augustine, to expand the city of God. I think, by the way, for non-believers, they look at that lack of visceralness, and they go, "Why would I sign up for something that's not visceral?"
Yeah. Andrew Tate famously said, he said, "I picked Islam because there's no Christians with any backbone."
Right.
Yeah.
And he's not wrong. There's no Christians. And by the way, he's in Europe. He's out of Europe, where that's a totally different thing over there. My European listeners, God bless you. Look for Jesus. But how do we, if America is the last best hope, that shining city on a hill, and I fundamentally believe, outside of demography and geography, I fundamentally believe we are. How do we get more Jesus? How do we inject more Jesus into the system?
Yeah, I think we're probably, I don't know. It seems like we're entering a period of sifting. well, we're in a period of sifting, but it started with COVID. Okay, there was a great kind of tearing, if you will, of the fabric of Protestantism. A lot of folks that 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 I think opened a lot of people's eyes to some fissures that were beneath the surface that were just waiting for a moment to erupt. And they did. They erupted. And I think things, the tectonic plates are still moving.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and they haven't settled yet. In other words, uh, the fault lines are still moving, and we won't know exactly who's where. Although I think it is sorting out some. I think it is starting to become more clear now, but I wouldn't say it's over by any stretch of the imagination. I think once that retrenchment happens and it's behind us, you know, is that in 5 years? Is it in 10 years? It's certainly coming. I think once that retrenchment happens, there will be. I think it'll be a lot easier to get some things done because we'll know who's where and where everybody kind of sits on this thing. I think in the meantime, education is a really big deal for your kids. And so, if you're public schooling, that's fine. Just know that they're getting the secularism, they're getting the now-ism. Okay, and so the science classes aren't even pretending anymore to be. I mean, they are full on evolution. A lot of the science classes are going to be full on humanism. Okay, that certainly the social classes are social sciences. So I would say that it's incumbent upon parents, whether if your kids are in public school or not, but certainly if they are in public school, it's incumbent upon parents to take charge of your child's education in any setting, but particularly in that setting, because they're going to have to. They desperately need a parent to speak truth into their lives to help them combat the lies that they're being told in their classrooms. Because I promise you, they're being told many. And then I would say, because it is generational, I would say being plugged into a good church where your kids are going to be surrounded with folks that, because that's the other thing is these relationships that I was talking about building locally, they got to be intergenerational. Like we've got to get over the, hey, boomers are morons and millennials don't know what they're talking about. Like that's got to go bye-bye, especially for Christians. Like we got to get that out of the way, because at the end of the day, everybody has got a part to play in this, and we need all comers to rebuild this society that's been smashed, in my humble opinion.
So one of the things we focus on, we're rounding the corner here with Brian, and it's been a great conversation. I very rarely get to do these types of conversations in this kind of depth with books like The End of the World is Just the Beginning and The Fourth Turning, with folks like with folks like Brian. So I want to thank you, Brian, for joining me today in this conversation. As we turn the corner here, I want this podcast this year to be focused on solutions to problems, because I fundamentally believe that winter is almost over. Yes, we're in the middle of we are currently in the first quarter of an election year in 2024. Who knows how that will play out? You all will hear me talk about this in perpetuity on the internet forever. Just know that at the time of this recording, I don't know anything, and neither do you, by the way. We're all going to live in it together. But an election will happen. It will. And then we'll be on the other side of that election, by the way. And I think probably by 2030 at the latest, a lot of this nonsense will be we'll be at the end of the fourth turning. We'll be officially at the end of it, and we will be ready to be into a high. I tell people all the time, I'm seeing green shoots. I'm seeing little buds that indicate spring is coming on different moribund trees in culture, in politics, in the overall economy, in finances, um, in theology. I'm seeing little shoots pop out. So on the theological tree, I'm seeing everything that Doug Wilson is doing with Canon Press and many other folks, by the way, who follow his model and are doing what he's doing. I'm seeing folks on the internet, pastors on the internet, who don't get more than 100 people in their congregation and yet have 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 million views on YouTube talking about the gospel. And their names aren't names that you would know, like a John MacArthur or an Alistair Begg or anybody else, right? They're not names you would know. They're not names from Pache, what Brian just said. They're not names from the boomer generation. That's the theological tree. On the economic tree, I'm seeing more and more people talking about how we have to return to free market economics. And not only that, we have to get a hold of our budget. We have to get a hold of our national budget. And by the way, not the Fed chair. I'm talking about Congress people. I'm seeing more in the governmental tree, the states. And it's not just the border crisis. You know, every single time there's an opposing party in Congress, with increasing regularity during the last 20 years, states who are in the opposing camp suddenly discover the 10th Amendment. They suddenly miraculously discover that actually the states have rights. How about that? And by the way, if you want to live in a state that has abortion and birth control and transgenderism on demand, you can live there. And if you want to move to a state that has the Hulu version of The Handmaid's Tale going on, you can move to that too. We have freedom of movement in this country. Go away. Go find your people, right? I'm seeing more and more of that. And COVID, by the way, poured a lot of gasoline on that fire, but I'm seeing more and more of that. In the entertainment area, most notably, because this is where culture pops up, I'm seeing more and more people producing things independently. Videos, movies, podcasts, books. We are finally now to the point where everybody kind of understands how the internet works. Not social media, the internet. And they understand that it is a relationship and connection machine, but it's also primarily a publishing and distribution machine. The green shoots are starting to pop out on the trees. Spring is coming. For the nomads among us, those of us who have just done survival for the last 20 years, and we might not get a 401k, and we probably won't get Social Security. That's probably not going to happen. They may have old age pensions for us. They may do a specific carve out for 25 million of us, maybe. But I doubt it, because usually in a high, all of the folks that reminded you of the last crisis typically get shoved to the side. And so all of us who didn't take the jab and who will probably live very long because we didn't do that, who are in that 61 to 81, who were born in that 61 to 81 year range. What advice do we have, Brian, for the leaders in that group who will soon be the prophetic old men? I think back in history, I believe Dwight Eisenhower was part of the nomad generation. Fought in World War I, learned every single thing that could have been done wrong in World War I. And then when World War II popped up, Eisenhower was given the reins. He was allowed to run free and eventually became president. A cautious man, a survivor. A Truman also was part of that 13th generation, right? But on the younger end of it, right? Again, a guy who was in World War I and went back to I love this about Truman, my last favorite Democrat. Went back to a haberdashery shop in Missouri. And by the way, when he stopped being president, you know what he did? He got in his car and drove back to his hat shop in Missouri. That's a nomad.
Yeah.
That's a Gen Xer. And by the way, he died in obscurity. Like, when he died, there was a state funeral, and that was it. He was done. He was gone, just out of the world, right? Eisenhower, of course, gave us the whole, watch out for the military-industrial complex, and then realized that his words weren't going to be heeded and died anyway.
Yeah,
this is classically what happens to nomads.
Right. He was right.
We're right because we've seen it, and yet during a high, no one wants to hear that, right? Yeah. And typically it goes, by the way, a high, an awakening, and then there's a crisis period. But there's like this, there's a piece I'm forgetting, but then there's a crisis period and there's another high. These are the cycles. So we are coming into a high. We're going to be coming into a high fairly soon here. I think it will be a high driven by technological optimism. I think it will be a high driven by cultural optimism. I think it will be a high driven by economic optimism, but it will not look like what we experienced during the middle part of the 20th century. It will look radically different. It'll look like 1 million ants probably floating along. How do we lead? How do the nomads lead after we've been survivors for so long?
Yeah, I think the temptation is going to be to become cynical, and so I would just say resist the urge to become the curmudgeon. So the thing. So I think about in my own life, like the older men that have meant the most to me were the ones who were encouraging me. Okay. And I mean, that's not to say they never, they never pointed out anything that, I could be doing better. That's not what happened. But the people who are encouraging are the people who are going to be sought out for advice, for time. And so I would just say to my fellow Gen Xers, begin to cultivate the things that will build an encouraging spirit within yourself. Like again, and that I'm not saying again not to to just be a yes man in your old age, but to understand that hey, we're not ultimately in control. None of us are. It's never going to be perfect. And but the people that we're talking to are eternal souls, and we will see them again. We will. We're going to be spending a very long time with them on the other side of the grave. And so when you wake up in that place, it's better to not be saying I'm sorry a bunch of times. That's just my own thoughts.
You mean there might be crankiness in the kingdom of heaven that might be allowed in?
Yeah. I'm just saying, resist the urge. Resist the urge.
Resist the urge. Well, I do. I think between 2025 and 2030, we're going to end. The fourth turning is going to end. I think spring is coming. I also think that the people who I would add to that, I think that the Gen Xers who offer solutions, no matter how wild-eyed and crazy they sound now, are going to be the ones that are going to be made leaders. Invariably, that is how it occurs. Worst comes to worst. Let's say there's another economic collapse, or potentially a geopolitical flare-up that turns into a war. Okay. The leaders in those types of periods, when the crisis is almost over, are going to be the ones not only who lead strategically and tactically through the crisis, but begin to make plans for the peace.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is what George C. Marshall and Eisenhower and all those guys who were invited to Bretton Woods did. And by the way, it's what their predecessors at the end of World War I at Versailles failed to do, which set the table for Hitler and for problems they were going to need to solve. And by the way, Churchill knew it. Eisenhower knew it. All those guys at the end of World War I who didn't have any power, who were just survivors, knew that MacArthur knew it, that were going to be a problem. They knew it was going to be a problem.
Well, think about too, like the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, right, enabled the the North and the South to come back together again, right? There were people who had enough foresight at the time to say, hey, we should name the United States military posts in the South after Confederate generals as a means of bringing healing to this land.
Right.
So we had a Fort Hood and we had a Fort Bragg. These are Union military bases. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're putting them in southern states, and as a gesture of reconciliation, right? We're naming them after Confederate generals. It's going to take that level of forward thinking, right? And not people that are clutching their pearls and getting their feelings hurt because of something, or whatever,
Well, I also think, I think it's time for, and maybe not time. I think it might be a really good idea if you are listening to this and you are curious about picking up the book, The Fourth Turning, which I recommend you pick up, or Peter Zeihan's The End of the World is Just the Beginning. I recommend reading those two books together. And we'll have links, of course, to those two books in the show notes below this podcast episode. I think it would be a really good idea also to turn off social media, delete it from your phone, and go into real life. Talk with people in real life. Because there is a split that has occurred between the people who consume everything on social media and believe that's reality, and the people who are walking around, and the leaders who are going to be the leaders, I believe, in the next high, who are going to propose solutions. Again, no matter how radical and wackadoo they may sound, are going to be the people who understand that reality, flesh and bone reality, created by God, not by Google, is going to be the thing that will save the Republic and probably save the West for future archetypical generations yet to come. Brian, I'd like to thank you for coming on the podcast today. This was a great conversation. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. This is a ton of fun. I always enjoy this one. It's great.
And with that, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.